fraud. I'm one of a number of people on this side of the House that often speaks out to tackling fraud, so I do object a little bit to one of the two of the comments we've made with the opposition benches that these benches are not bothered about fraud. Absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. For a number of reasons. It's obviously the cost to our taxpayers. It is also very much undermines the very system that underpins our economy. Of course, if people do not feel that this game is a fair game that we can all play, then people are less chance of playing it. And it undermines the principle of everything I've stood for all my life, which is, in terms of being in business, and the fundamentals of a free market economy is that it is a fair and level playing field. It's absolutely fundamental. And fraud clearly undermines that. I do draw the House's attention to my register of members' interests, like the member for Broadlands. My company took a coronavirus business interruption loan, quite a sizable one, which we paid back in full without touching it, which I'm sure the Economic Secretary of the Treasury will be pleased to hear. We discussed it at length at the time, I think. I think it's very important to put this in context. Lord Agnew's statement, I had an urgent question on this last week following his statement, because I was very concerned with many of the things he said in that statement and in subsequent press articles. But bear in mind, he said in that press article, the bounce back loan scheme, which has been the feature of many of the comments made in the debates today, was an important and successful intervention. Yeah. Absolutely critical at the time. And of course, it's easy with hindsight to say that mistakes were made, but of course they were. The speed with which it was rolled out, and the initial iterations of the loan schemes, of course, did not have a bounce-back loan scheme. This was introduced at a later stage, absolutely vitally. Very briefly, yes.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with him in saying that the speed from when the Treasury sat down to devise a scheme to when they delivered the first loans was remarkable. To say he shared my disappointment that in the 10 years from 2010, when we knew a pandemic was coming, there was absolutely no planning whatsoever done for the economic impacts on business of the protective measures that the government might be forced to implement when the pandemic finally got here.
Well, it makes a very good point. I think the whole country would acknowledge now we need to be better prepared for a future pandemic. And I think one of the things we absolutely need to learn from this is to have a template ready in the future in terms of bounce-back loans and other things that we can roll out at pace. But you cannot undermine the ability of that scheme to get business money out to businesses in need. It absolutely did so. I also like to quote just from the British Business Bank, who said the key counter-fraud measures were consistent with the design of the scheme were in place from the outset. So it's not the case these schemes are rolled out without any consideration of the potential for fraud. I think it does highlight, therefore, what checks and balances are actually in place, and the Paymaster General sets out some in his speech which were very useful, and looking at which banks performed better and followed those checks and balances and took into account those checks and balances, because, as Lord Agnew said, 81% of the guarantee that's been called on so far, which hasn't been paid so far, as far as I understand from the Treasury, relates to 2 of the 7 biggest banks. 81%. So clearly, some banks did better than others at know your client checks and fraud checks. So clearly, we need to understand exactly what happened. It can't just be a case we roll out a scheme and we let the scheme run and that's it. Clearly, the implication in terms of recovering loans is hugely important. We need that dashboard of information that Lord Agnew called for, so we can clearly understand the performance of banks. One criticism I would level at the Treasury on all this stuff: there should be far more transparency about which banks are issuing loans, what percentage of success of applications, their success in terms of recovering loans. But also, I would, even as somebody who took a loan in our business, I would advocate complete transparency in which businesses are taking loans. If you lay all this open, access to government loan schemes or the furlough scheme or whatever, it would be far easier for the public and for the media and parliamentarians to hold individual businesses to account. I think businesses who are taking these for the wrong purposes, perhaps nefarious purposes, will be far less likely to try and access these loans in the first place. So far greater transparency, but certainly transparency around bank performance now in terms of getting this taxpayers' money back. Economic crime bill, many people have called for, absolutely. This is something a number of us have been banging on about for some time. This could really help part of this economic crime bill. One of the elements of this is a failure to prevent economic crime, corporate liability. I think that corporate liability should extend to individuals rather than at corporate level. The number one thing you could do to deter financial organisations or corporations or even smaller corporations from defrauding people or enabling fraud or money laundering is to say to the individuals behind those companies that you personally would be held responsible. This could have an effect in terms of the bounce back loan scheme itself if those banks who are less, probably a little bit less, cared a little bit less about where this money went to, could have been held to account, certainly through the senior managed regime in the Financial Conduct Authority, potentially by other charges as well. Failure to prevent is absolutely fundamental to the economic crime bill. So is Companies House reform. Absolutely clear that that should be the case. I know the government's doing something on this already. One of the perverse things about these Companies House at the moment, if you set up a business through a company formation agent, then you should be subject to money laundering checks by HMRC. If you set up a company directly in Companies House, there are no money laundering checks. That simply can't be right. So you can go to the one, can't get set up, and then you go to Companies House. So the Companies House needs to be a regulated rather than just a register. The register of overseas entities, and that doesn't come on the taxpayer, of course. A simple levy attached to the cost of creating a company, which is currently £12, would raise enough money to be that regulator. The register of overseas entities, so we can see who's trying to launder money through UK properties, absolutely critical. All this stuff the government's committed to. We just need it to commit to bring this forward in the next parliamentary session. Great to hear what the Chancellor said today on that, in terms of he seemed to be really keen on that being the next parliamentary session. Great to hear, and I think recent events hopefully will push us up the political agenda. One thing I think we really neglect in this whole conversation about cutting economic crime is the role of whistleblowers. Most economic crime is highlighted not by our very good agencies, which are good sometimes, but some of the legislation we'll bring in will help them take forward successful prosecutions, but they need the evidence in the first place. My honourable friend, the member for Barrow-in-Furness, who made a fantastic speech, I'm sure will agree to the fact that he has huge experience in this area. We need people to come forward with the evidence. Our regulators, our fraud agencies can only really be watchdogs rather than bloodhounds, and they need to be given access to the information in the first place. Our whistleblower protections in the UK are pretty woeful now compared to what they used to be. We used to be a world leader in this area. If we want to uncover economic crime, we've got to make sure the people who identify it, who highlight it, who help the Serious Fraud Office make these prosecutions stick, are protected. That is not the case at the moment. My constituent Ian Foxley highlighted the case of GPT Special Projects, £28 million of economic sanctions in Southwark Court against that company. For 10 years he'd gone without a penny, having had a six-figure salary in his role before that. He blew the whistle. He could say his whistleblowing led to the Airbus fine of £3 billion, of which £860 million came to the Treasury. He has gone without a penny. And absolutely has not had a single penny. It cannot be right. We've got to make sure these people are protected when they come forward, and I would argue are properly compensated for the distress and the financial impact that has on their lives. Thank you, Madam.